Religion in fiction has always fascinated me. Not just because it combines one of my favourite things with something I've studied for quite some time in my life, but because you can see so much of a creator's philosophy in how they present religion in their work. In my sphere, the tabletop role-playing game sphere, it is very, very difficult to present any sort of real feeling faith in your creative output at all, as players often don't have the bandwidth to think beyond the normal faith expressions that they grow up in their culture. Or they just don't have the inclination to get involved with all that religion stuff. Part of this is some sort of escapist ideal. They don't want to get involved in their time playing in the real world tensions and turmoils that these sorts of topics can generate. And part of it is an unwillingness to present some sort of authentic faith to the world that they're pretending to be in. Whether that's because they've got faith of their own and that might be an awkward mismatch, or because they're not that comfortable presenting any sort of faith at all. So oftentimes, especially in tabletop role-playing games, but also across all of fiction, our presentations of religion, whether done by players or by the creators themselves, often feel kind of flat and not as rich and deep and complex and fascinating as real-world faith can indeed be. Nowhere is this clearer than in the phenomenon of evil gods, malignant, malicious entities of chaos, disorder, death, and betrayal, who twist the hearts and minds of their followers to ruin and destruction and will eventually bring about the end of things. In the past, I've criticised the use of evil gods across fantasy, arguing, for example, that there's no sane person who would devote their entire life to the god of betrayal, but I have come to believe that there is more nuance in this subject. Today, we're going to explore some of the things about evil gods, whether they can exist, how they can exist, and how people might actually find it within themselves to worship such repellent entities, how people might act against their perceived self-interest, and what place faith and fear hold in our understanding of religion. We'll begin with that last point, the discussion of faith and fear. Oftentimes these words get used in real-world religious communities, and especially in fantastical religious communities, as opposites. Statements like, "We, the faithful, overcome our fear," or "faith conquers fear," are especially common in real-world faiths which focus more on evangelizing, especially, I will say, among Christian faith communities. Essentially, what this all boils down to is creating a difference between legitimate faith, which is motivated by faith alone, and a less legitimate form of faith motivated by fear. This is often used to delineate your group who does it right from another group who does it wrong, oftentimes within the same religion. It is the basis of much of sectarian basic philosophy. Your faith is clearly well motivated. It is so rational and it makes sense based on the faith that you hold in the fact that you believe the truth. You don't need fear to keep you on the tracks because your faith is so self-evident. But these other guys, well, they're afraid to let go of the falsehoods that they cling to and accept the actual truth. It happens across the world, across history. Conquistadors observe the native South Americans engaging in pure fear-based superstition of their own deities. That's how they see it, of course. They're barbarically sacrificing people to their evil, scary gods. The Romans make basically the same claim about druidic practices in the British Isles. The fact of the matter is, complex religions are often reduced to fear-based superstitions by outsiders to delegitimize extant forms of faith that aren't their own. But the thing that makes all this really interesting is that these reductive critiques aren't entirely wrong. What we in the modern day term as having faith is relatively new, all things considered. For most of history, for most people living in stable societies, that is, or who aren't parts of fervent religious minorities, having a personal, justifiable, self-evident faith that you defend as a personal belief of your own wasn't necessarily that important. And it wasn't necessarily the yardstick in, again, settled, stable societies with some dominant faith of how pious you were. Much of historical religious activity happened either in collective, organised practices led by competent agents of the gods, or private meditation and activity in the context of more localised shrines or altars or things of that description, or religious objects more generally. This also sometimes includes ritual contexts of activity like butchering animals in many faiths. Again, this is most people. In every era, in every faith, there are committed, competent experts who disagree on the interpretation, meaning, activity and function of these ritual acts that are done by them and by the masses. They seek to refine and correct these ritual acts to get closer to the divine. See bishops, ascetics, monks, gurus, bodhis, prophets, shamans, and rabbis, for some examples. I would argue that fundamentally, for most persons of history, not the competent experts, for everyone else, the practice of religious activity was not engendered purely by a personal, self-evident faith, but also by the notion of fear. Now, before this gets too sacrilegious to literally every faith out there, let me explain what I mean. I have in the past framed ritual acts done by normal people, such as the burning of incense or food for the favour of a harvest god, as an act of entreating that deity for blessings and aid. That is just one side of the coin, though. Because you could just as easily frame those actions another way, as an appeasement to ensure that a drought or blight does not come to your fields, as a tithe, a payment to this god to make sure that bad things don't happen to you. What's the difference between asking for help and a protection racket? Fundamentally, I would say in these videos that I've produced over the course of my time on the internet, my estimations of social practices tend positive, largely because I am an eternal optimist. I mean, that might sound weird coming from the hyper-pedantry channel, but I like to see the good in things. This is why, in my video on polytheism from over a year ago, I claim that Baal, the Forgotten Realms Lord of Murder, would not be followed by any sane person. There's two things wrong with this assertion that I have made. First, some people want other people dead. The sheer amount of curses, vendettas, duels, and blood feuds in human history should tell us enough about the propensity of people to really hate each other's guts so much that they want them and their loved ones dead. People have been wishing death on people they don't like forever. Secondly, while it is true that fewer people would choose to worship at a shrine to a god of murder than a god of family or the harvest, that's only true if we consider quite a narrow and modern and largely fairly Western view of worship, of a specific ritual dedicated to a specific deity in order to get some form of spiritual cleansing or benefit or protection or something of that nature. That's what we see worship as today. Especially in polytheistic faiths, this kind of ceremonial worship is not necessarily the main place where religious social activity occurs. For example, the wearing of charms. bracelets, symbolic clothes or items, the practice of adhering to taboos and superstitions, and even just attendance at cultural events and festivals could all be considered to build one's relationship with a deity or a group of deities. And these can all occur without a formalised act of worship. Imagine necklace charms with the Lord of Murder's visage on one side, specifically to be worn facing away from the body, never touching your own flesh and therefore never being flipped over, to ensure that the Lord of Murder's eyes never turn onto you. Maybe there's taboos on never saying the murder god's name except when you're specifically referring to what you know to be a murder, creating some cagey behaviour and only invoking that name at the most opportune and powerful magical moment. Perhaps blood should always be cleansed of any bloody blade as quickly as possible, so that the Lord of Murder can't see you through that blood of death. It's also practical blade keeping advice as well. Or even just attending executions could be part of the worship system of this Lord of Murder, especially if you have a taboo of never looking into the eyes of an executed murderer. Again, to avoid the glare of the Lord of Murder. All of these acts would be recognitions of the god's domain and power, but few would count today in our modern Western world as acts of worship, of sacrifice, or indeed of prayer. This is kind of like how goodbye has entered our regular cultural lexicon with no sense of itself as a prayerful act or a blessing of any sort, despite the fact that goodbye literally just comes from a contraction of God be with you. But there's another thing we need to clear up. Is a god with a dark and miserable domain necessarily evil? Can we make an evil god just by slapping on a really, really horrible thing like plague to their divine portfolio of competencies? Hades, Shiva and Set are all examples I've used of evil gods in the past, and their domains do refer to death, destruction, and many other unpleasant things besides. But all three of these entities serve very important and respectable positions in the pantheons they occupy. These are complex deities who historically have had cults reflecting some of their more positive aspects, and cults which focus on some of their more destructive aspects as well. You could even say our Lord of Murder fits somewhere in this mould as well, seeing as murder can be a significantly useful tool in sparking social revolution. Killing could be theoretically done for the good of others, or, depending on how punisher your motivation is, for keeping a sense of justice in the world. And it could be seen that the Lord of Murder's domain also covers murder of creatures that are a danger to society, or monsters perhaps. It could be the god of adventurers, or maybe even the domain covers protection from murder as well. Another category of god that really struggles to be evil is one that is specifically designed as transcendental to human or personal morality. In the Abrahamic faith, especially the God of the Hebrew Bible, cannot really be judged by human ethical standards. Yahweh cannot be called necessarily evil, as that is a human-made term, and therefore in much of this kind of theology doesn't apply, cannot apply to something that is transcendental to all human knowledge and understanding. The intents of these kind of deities are beyond what any of us can ever know or imagine. We can't legitimately describe such a deity as evil within the systems of this particular faith, at least. Of course, any faith or any non-faithful person can, and often do, describe such entities as pure evil. I feel like that sometimes misses the nuance, and indeed there is a lot of nuance here. There's, well, thousands of years of nuance. And with the historic role that fear, in part, has played in religious activity throughout history, I mean, including even today, people don't want to go to hell. That's kind of a big thing, and as much as it may be more socially and personally gratifying to claim that one's own sense of faith or enlightenment or worship is completely untainted by those sorts of things, it requires an exceptional person, an exceptional mindset to manage that in reality, to break free of that cycle of samsara, as it would be called in Buddhist philosophy. I mean, Buddhist philosophy encourages you to face death and nothingness with your entire being, which can be quite the fearful act, and Buddha himself went through great turmoil in his quest for enlightenment. Sikhism also encourages the abandonment of worldly fear of things like death, but it also encourages Sikhs to have fear for God and the gurus. This is often modernised today from fear into a sense of awe, which can indeed have both positive and negative connotations. It's a fascinating word, awe, giving us awesome and awful, which theoretically should mean the same thing. Language is fun. But it is definitely true that fear response is important, whether you characterise it as awe or not, in a Sikh response to the divine. Most Christians and Muslims would not claim that their God is evil, despite creating possibly the most fearful place in their cosmologies, hell. At the worst, the divine is unknowable and transcendent to human morality, causing fear in one's own followers, and perhaps guiding their hearts through that fear also doesn't seem to constitute an evil deity in the vast majority of religious philosophy. So if you want to make an evil god, you can fairly easily, especially if that entity is being viewed from outside of the religious structure that it sits within. Because you can have a complex deity, you can have a complex god, you can have something that is unknowable, you can do all of these things that today's religions have done to justify when their gods start acting in ways that don't reflect human morality. But what could a purely evil god look like? Something that doesn't have excuses. Something that can be judged on human morality, whose plans are in a timeline that fits within our understanding, who is knowable and intentionally destructive to the rights and hopes and realities of people, offering no recourse to its followers or chosen ones even. After all, Yahweh's sending of plagues, destruction of armies, destruction of swaths of the human population is all in service of protecting his chosen people. It therefore should not be seen as evil by those who are among that chosen population. Rather, it is the fulfillment of a true covenantal promise. What we're really looking for, in terms of a pure evil deity, is something like the devil. It is rare in myth and legend to have deities who are purely, unequivocally, unquestionably, purely evil. No redeeming features, no justifications, no tragic backstory. The Christian fallen angel Lucifer himself has far too much of a complex, interwoven backstory to be considered pure evil, especially as he sits under God's broad domain. Similarly, in Islam, since Iblis is under Allah's broad domain and authority, the devil can only serve as a test, a temptation, not as an independently purely evil entity itself, because it is all part of the divine schema. A similar situation is held in Jewish tradition too. Satan is only allowed to act by Yahweh's will. It feels like we need to look outside monotheisms. Frankly, the notion of a single divine authority seems incompatible with a free-acting agent of pure evil and ill will. As discussed earlier, deities in polytheistic systems exist so that people may take notice of them and engage in ritual behaviour to either appease, please, or stay their hand. This does mean, however, that real-world deities need to have some reason why people might actually care about them. Because if no one is going to give this divine entity any credence at all, any either fear, adulation, adoration, worship, whatever we want to call it, if it's going to have any cultural significance at all, if this deity has no purpose, no cultural purpose in the entire system of this polytheistic faith, who the hell invented it? Cloacina, the Roman goddess of the main sewer outflow system in Rome, is a perfect example of a deity that does exist because that is undeniably a useful thing to hope continues to work. Even Loki, who has the domains of mischief, trickery, and deception, all of which were really bad things to do if you were an upstanding man in a Norse believing system. Even Loki had utility. He was an absolute bastard in the Norse myths, that's for sure. But in these myths, he's a useful bastard who gets problems solved when the proper stoic, masculine and manly ways fail. Of course, he also causes many problems of his own. The point is, in any system, any faith, there must be some discernible purpose in venerating a deity, or even having a deity of a certain thing. Why bother praying at an altar to a being that literally serves no possible advantage? Why bother building that altar in the first place, and why bother including that deity? Even if you believe they might exist somewhere out in the cosmos, why bother including them in a story? It's wasted space. I would argue, and this might be bold, but I would argue that the reasons I've just set out, there are probably no purely evil deities in any real world faith. But in fantasy, pure evil deities can exist, because they don't need stories and worship to exist. They don't need to be part of a religious system that is coherent and makes sense and has space for all of these deities to gain some sort of special day or special worship or whatever. There could just be a guy out there in the cosmos with the powers of a god who is an irredeemable, evil bastard. The devils of fiction don't have to be, by nature of it being a theological system, they don't have to be beholden to the guy on top. So in some cases, fiction's devils can just be pure evil guys. But it still seems tough, right? How can you be a god, a deity, if no one would worship you? Not even if no one would invent you, but if no one would even possibly worship you, if you even exist. If you exist externally independent of any theological system, if you're a guy who is purely evil, how could you be worshipped as a god? As long as you're following the pure evil ethos to give no benefit of any sort to anyone who worships you. I mean, you could argue that the Forgotten Realms Levistus, the devil prince of betrayal, is one such entity that kind of fits this mould, although the source text is very clear that he is not a god. Definitely not. As his followers, they are encouraged to betray their peers for the Prince of Betrayal, who will inevitably, because that's his bloody nature, betray them and lead them into tough suffering and eternal torment in the cold lair of hell. He has a cult of worshippers, but the Forgotten Realms refuses to call him a god. Partly for categorization reasons, and partly, I would suggest, for recent historical moral reasons. The satanic panic has probably put paid to any chance of a worshipped deity with multiple distinct cults and sects worshipping them and giving them divine power. Can't be a god because they're a devil, obviously. It seems that the only way to have worshippers who will worship you willingly without getting anything of any value at all as a reward, as the true ethos of a purely evil being should be, are to use fear and misinformation. But you could also target those people who do often act against their own self-interest, such as those with strong ideological positions but low self-awareness, or people whose trauma makes them believe that they deserve to suffer, and those who legitimately seek for themselves and others to have a horrible time, often through their own actions, such as members of accelerationist cults. And pure evil entities might indeed have a field day with these kinds of non-rational positions. Indeed, for any purely evil entity, the fact that you can lead humans to cause their own suffering without misleading them or promising them any sort of benefit is a major coup. At the point that you have worshippers worshipping you legitimately because of the things that you do, which in turn are causing them miserable suffering and pain with no promise of reward, at that point, I think you've probably earned the title of pure evil deity. And this is something else that I have been wrong about. In my video on cults, through my eternal optimism, I suggested that no one, under any reason, would follow a purely evil entity which had no benefit. Very few people acting with sane and rational minds would choose to follow a leader with no promise of any sort of benefit and indeed a demonstrable trail of suffering in their wake. But it happens. Because worshippers of destructive, purely evil entities would be drawn from exactly these sorts of ranks. From self and society loathing people who want to see the world at least acknowledge their pain. People who fear irrelevance and that their life means nothing. And this is where fear really returns to our equation. Still not as some diametrically opposed oppositional force to faith, but as a conduit to it. Because as I hope I've demonstrated today, you can absolutely justify a deity who is perceived as evil in any fictional world. There are many in our real world, it just depends on your perspective. And goodness, people follow mob bosses and vigilantes, and they'd pay you good money to keep danger away from those that they care about, not to worry about the others. But a purely evil god, as I hope I've demonstrated, is a harder thing to do. You need to find those people who will sacrifice, worship, venerate and follow an entity like the Joker. But such people do exist. In fantasy and in real life, they are preyed on by various entities, companies, philosophies, social and indeed some religious movements which have nothing to give back. They offer no benefit, no kindness. To worship at the altar of pure evil, you need not be evil yourself. You need only believe that the suffering that you will receive is good. And I understand that I've said probably a lot of fairly controversial things in this video. I get that, and I get if you want to be mad at me about any of those in the comments. Fair. I personally have great respect for all faiths that do good in the world and do good in the hearts of their faithful and in the hearts of people around them. But if there is one thing, one emotional reaction that I do want you to take away, it is this. Check in. Reach out. If you believe someone is suffering in such a way, it's worth it. It's worth a try. Because as I've said on a couple of occasions, during this video, I am an eternal optimist, and I don't think that's wrong. But that aside, sorry, I guess, evil is a tough, nebulous topic, and I haven't done it all justice here. I mean, how much can you get from a video ostensibly about fantasy evil gods, really? Now, philosophers have been philosophizing on this subject for ever, and there's still not a clear answer on what evil even is. A privation of the good, an innate unborn quality unlocked by hardship. I can't answer these questions, really. But I hope I gave you something to think about. Maybe something useful for your fantasy philosophizing or anything else that may be the case. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeonmaster. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I get to see you in the next video. Just to step back in for a second, I'm fine. I realised that was a lot. All good on this end. I hope you're doing okay. Just I thought it worth stating. Absolutely in a great position in my life. I'm very happy. Goodness, I'm very happy that you're here. Frankly, you're sticking around and giving me your time. But yeah, just wanted to make sure everyone knows. All good on my end. Have a great week, guys.